Penguin Random House Audio presents Loved One, a novel, by Aisha Muharrar. Read for you by Ladji. 1. There was no bride. There was no groom. No seating chart with my name in calligraphy. A blue dot next to Julia indicating a preference for fish. No DJ coaxing guests to the dance floor with a multi-generational crowd pleaser. No maid of honor fiddling with a sheet of white printer paper, unfolding it from eighths to fourths, then taking a theatrical deep breath before she says, "Okay, so." Which made sense because it was not a wedding. But there were approximately 100 of us gathered at Berkeley City Club, a grand Italian Renaissance revival building often rented out for private events, like weddings. And there were 2 sections of dark wood folding chairs, separated by a wide stripe of hardwood floor. An aisle, if you will. And more important, it just felt like it should have been a wedding. It's what we did that year. We went to weddings. Not together, though Gabe did ask the year before, when the invitations went out and before he'd started dating Elizabeth, if I'd be his +1 to the Tokyo wedding of his percussionist and backup vocalist. They'd met on tour with him. I would have loved to go to Japan, but I already had another wedding on the same day. By September, I'd been to 6 and RSVP'd to 3 more. I was 30. Gabe, born the same year but in December, was 29. And apparently we'd entered that stage of life where if you haven't nailed down your version of semi-formal cocktail attire, you'd better do it quick, because that's what your weekends were going to be for the next decade. This perpetual wedding season was such a well-known truth about people our age that I could feel an awareness of it in the room as I stood up, clutching my own folded sheet of printer paper, and began to speak about my dear friend Gabe. It was one of the things I had to avoid saying in Gabe's eulogy, the obvious thing, that he was only 29, and his death was so sudden, by anyone's estimation, it would have been more likely I was speaking at the happiest day of his life. My dear friend Gabe. This was the one line I'd prepared, and now I'd said it. I'd hoped to come up with more by the time I arrived at the funeral. In my studio as I packaged orders, on the flight from LA, the car ride from the airport. But no, nothing. I lowered the microphone, stalling for time, and tried to remember how I was supposed to feel about Gabe. Outside, UC Berkeley students chatted on the street below us. Cars and trucks drove along the city's concrete hills. It was a beautiful, cloudless day. Gabe was the kind of friend who was more like family, I said. This was true. Having briefly dated as teenagers, when we met again in our 20s, we became friends so quickly it was clear we worked better that way. And we'd remained close for years. I could always count on him, I continued, launching into one quickly delivered anecdote after another to prove this point. As I scanned the faces in front of me, mostly Gabe's music associates and peers, plus both sides of his family, his father, his cousins, the aunts who'd flown in from Colombia, and his mother and her relatives and friends, I was sure none of them could tell, but I knew there was a disconnect between the words I was saying and what I was feeling. Not because I was in shock or numb, though I probably was both in shock and numb. And not because the stories weren't real. I had plenty of examples of Gabe being sweet and constant. Of course, it would never have been painless giving that eulogy, but it should have been easier. The problem was, even though Gabe was one of my closest friends, the month before, we'd made a dumb mistake and slept together. An immediate and important caveat. Gabe and I were actual friends. I won't mention this again because then the lady doth protest too much, but the point has to be made. We weren't the kind of friends who were never really friends. The kind of friends you see in a romantic comedy where there are 2 incredibly attractive people who are deeply emotionally invested in each other, and we're supposed to believe they never once considered the idea of sexual intercourse. The kind of friends who are secretly in love with each other and only realize minutes before one of them is about to get married or leave town, and the next thing you know, they're jumping in a car or on a horse or running down the street, whatever, and they tumble into bed, or out of frame, depending on the rating of the movie. Having several male friends, this depiction of male-female friendship was always a pet peeve of mine. But somehow Gabe and I had tumbled. Onto a couch, not a bed, but then, yes, eventually a bed too. And we'd ended up in this exact ridiculous situation. Except we'd done worse than that because we hadn't even gotten a stolen honeymoon or new zip code. We'd just made a real and awful mess of everything. But, you may be thinking, there's always a chance to make things better, even if it gets really bad. If you're truly good friends, then you can work it out. And absolutely, totally you can. Unless, 3 weeks later, one of you dies. Oh, Julia, he loved you. The first person I spoke to after my eulogy was Gabe's manager, Kathy Liu. We were in the restroom. It was small, with 2 narrow stalls and 2 side-by-side sinks. Kathy was middle-aged, probably closer to my mom's age than mine. She was wearing a Tina Turner concert tee over a long-sleeved black dress. Gabe's mother, Leora, had asked that instead of the usual funeral garb, in honor of Gabe's career as a musician, we wear our favorite concert tees. I'd chosen a Billy Joel's The Stranger shirt, an inside joke for no one but the deceased, under a black tuxedo jacket. It was clear Leora wanted Gabe's funeral to be a departure from traditional mourning, and as much of a celebration of his life as possible. His producer and frequent collaborator, Jabari Bernier, was currently leading a 20-minute musical tribute with a jazz quartet. A time of reflection is what it said in the program. A time for a bathroom break is how several people interpreted it. I'd avoided the long line for the women's room and found an empty restroom downstairs. Well, empty until Kathy walked in. She hugged me, then took a step back, concentrating with concern as if she were appraising car wreckage. "He just adored you," Kathy said, clutching my hands in hers. "I remember we were headed to a show in Houston, and he kept saying, 'Julia's going to be near here. You have to leave some time so I can see Julia.' And I said, 'Okay, where's Julia staying? Which hotel in Houston?'" I knew this story. Kathy had told it to me before. She was one of those people who connected with acquaintances by continually reminding them of the single experience they shared, imbuing an anecdote with dramatic reverence, as if it were Carrie Strugg's Olympic vault or some other monumental event worthy of its own 10-part docuseries. Now, finally, we'd reached the episode about the dismount. "And then," he said, "oh no, Julia's staying in Austin." "Austin?" I said. "That may as well be a different state, honey." But I got him there. So sweet. I had once found this story sweet, too. Now it was, at best, proof that Gabe was terrible at state geography. Kathy rested her funeral program on the edge of the sink. Gabriel Wolfe Martell, 1986 to 2016. "I'm sorry we couldn't reach you directly. Our priority was Leora." "Of course," I said. I'd found out the same way everyone else had, through the internet. I was at a workbench in my studio tightening the prong setting of a bespoke ruby ring, the chain nose pliers gripped between my thumb and index finger. Mandy, the new production manager for my jewelry line, was at her desk. Mandy had only worked for me for a few weeks, but we'd hit it off instantly after realizing we'd both grown up the only black girl in a mostly white suburban school. There was often an immediate bond with other onlys, a shared interest in things that would probably go on some ill-conceived "this is for white people" list that we'd come by honestly and early before realizing those things weren't made with us in mind. Somewhere Mandy had a photo of herself with her all-white soccer team, and somewhere I had a similar picture. We got each other. But we hadn't known each other that long, and it can take some time for me to open up to people, which is why it wasn't her fault when she looked up from her laptop and gasped. "Wait, don't you know one of the guys from Separate Bedrooms?" "It's just Gabe," I said. This was a common mistake. Separate Bedrooms wasn't a band of 4 or 5 guys. It was a stage name for one person. "Oh," she said, her voice tentative. "People are saying he,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?